The Manston Asylum Centre in Kent has the capacity to hold a maximum of 1,600 people, and any one person should be kept there for a maximum of 24 hours. But as of last night, there were 4,000 people detained at the centre, with some families having been kept there for 3 to 4 weeks. The conditions sound appalling, with families sleeping on mats on the floor, and there have been outbreaks of scabies and diphtheria. That's a highly contagious and potentially very serious bacterial infection. So how did this horrid situation arise? Well, according to the Sunday Times, this is all happening because Suella Braverman refused to book alternative accommodation for asylum seekers, and so Manston could not move them on. And apparently that was even after Braverman was advised by multiple civil servants that to continue detaining migrants in Manston would be a breach of the law. The Sunday Times quoted a number of sources with knowledge of the situation. One told them this: 3 weeks ago, she was told directly by Home Office officials of the illegality of the site. It is an unofficial detention centre. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she still went ahead with it. She was also told at the same time that this could lead to a public inquiry. So another source, this time a senior Whitehall source, said this: the law has been broken. It is an entirely illegal situation. You can't just detain people. The department is basically in despair. And then they have a government source saying this: when they get there, people are supposed to be processed and then released. They have their biometrics taken and should be sent to accommodation paid for by the Home Office, which means a hotel, or they are granted immigration bail. They can only hold someone if there is a reasonable prospect of their removal from the country in a sensible time frame. She was refusing to sign off on bail or pay for hotels, which means she was illegally detaining people. There is no legal grounds for them to be detained. Officials have been put in an impossible position because they can't release people without Suella releasing the money. This has been going on for more than 3 weeks. So that looks at best like a complete abdication of responsibility from the Home Secretary. And Roger Gale, the Tory MP for North Thanet, which covers the Manston facility, went even further.
There are simply far too many people there, and this situation should never have been allowed to develop. And I'm not sure that it hasn't almost been developed deliberately.
Deliberately? Why?
It appears, I was told that the Home Office was finding it very difficult to secure hotel accommodation. I now understand that this was a policy issue and that a decision was taken not to book additional hotel space. Now, Nick, that's like driving a car down a motorway, seeing the motorway clear ahead, then there's a car crash, and then suddenly there's a 5-mile tailback. The car crash was the decision not to book more hotel space.
A decision, to be clear, taken directly by the Home Secretary?
I believe that is so, but I'm not sure which Home Secretary, whether it was Miss Patel or Mrs. Braverman.
As for which Home Secretary is responsible, Alex Wickham at Bloomberg has since said this: sources say there is a clear paper trail of emails showing Patel kept the hotel policy, Braverman stopped it against advice, and Shapps then reinstated it. This will emerge at an inquiry and show Braverman acted unlawfully, multiple sources say. Now, it's been suggested the motive for such a decision could be to try and deter more asylum seekers crossing the Channel, or to encourage Home Office staff to speed up the processing of migrants. Now, neither seem like they would plausibly work. People have already risked their lives to come here, and the reason processing has slowed to a snail's pace is because of budget cuts, not workers dragging their heels. Braverman was asked an urgent question in the House of Commons where she said this about the accusations that she'd ignored legal advice.
I foresaw the concerns at Manston in September and deployed additional resource and personnel to deliver a rapid increase in emergency accommodation. To be clear, like the majority of the British people, I am very concerned about hotels, but I have never blocked their usage. Indeed, since I took over, 12,000 people have arrived, 9,500 people have been transferred out of Manston or Western Jetfoil, many of them into hotels. And I've never ignored legal advice. As a former Attorney General, I know the importance of taking legal advice into account. At every point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have worked hard to find alternative accommodation to relieve the pressure at Manston. What I have refused to do is to prematurely release thousands of people into local communities without having anywhere for them to stay.
She said quite categorically she hasn't ignored legal advice. Now, we've heard a lot about lying to the Commons being a breach of the ministerial code and people having to resign. Now, there's a lot of sources saying she did ignore legal advice, and she's saying to Parliament she didn't. Later, in the response to questioning by Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, Braverman pulled out this shocker.
Let's be clear about what's really going on here, Madam Deputy Speaker. The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast and which party is not. Some 40,000 people have arrived on the south coast this year alone, many of them facilitated by criminal gangs, some of them actual members of criminal gangs. So let's stop pretending that they are all refugees in distress. The whole country knows that that is not true. And it's only the honourable members opposite who pretend otherwise. Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to be straight with the public. The system is broken. Illegal migration is out of control, and too many people are more interested in playing political parlour games, covering up the truth, than solving the problem.
Now, it should be fairly obvious that an excuse for Suella Braverman is not that these people weren't all refugees. Now, even if none of them were refugees, she's still broken the law. But on a sort of, the simple ethical point she's making is that we don't deserve the same duty of care to people who aren't refugees. Well, if only half of them are refugees, right, then you're still keeping a hell of a lot of people in illegal, horrendous conditions where they're at risk of catching very, very serious bacterial chest infections. Now, obviously, I don't need to say how disgusting it is to talk about people coming here for a better life or to flee persecution as an invasion. Ash, I want your thoughts on this. What do you make of this whole story? Suella Braverman seems quite confident that she can just ride this out. I'm tough on migrants and I'm willing to break the law to get my way.
Well, the reason why she's confident in being able to ride it out is because really she's merely the latest in a long line of Home Secretaries who've staked their political career on pandering to right-wing anti-asylum moral panics. And that's something that's a lot older than, the Sunak administration, and it's even a lot older than this particular run of Tory governments. And I think you can really see it start to kick off around the early 2000s, in particular 2003, after Rebecca Wade, at the time, now Rebecca Brooks, took over at The Sun. And the right-wing tabloids made anti-asylum hysteria a real cornerstone of their bashing New Labour project. Now, rather than standing up to a lot of that rhetoric, which at the time in the early 2000s was explicitly racist, there was a Mr. Men cartoon run in The Sun one day, which had various racist cartoons, which included Mr. Yardy, a black Rastafarian who had a gun in one hand and a spliff in the other, and also Mr. Asylum Seeker, who was portrayed as being Albanian, a pimp, and someone with like about 3 gold teeth in his head. That was the kind of press environment in the 2000s. And rather than standing up to it, what did the progressive centre left do? It totally kowtowed to that rhetoric. In fact, that there was collusion between David Blunkett and The Sun in terms of running their Asylum Madness Week, which meant that David Blunkett could come in and promise tougher measures. Now, that was the kind of the mood music. And I think what's, almost unfortunate for Suella Braverman is that she's not doing anything which is that different from her predecessors. Because yes, Priti Patel might have continued the hotel policy, but, she and Sajid Javid before her also oversaw horrendous conditions for asylum seekers, including in 2018, a spate of suicides by Eritrean teenagers who'd come to this country unaccompanied. They'd been, essentially left to rot in asylum accommodation, which was not fit for purpose. And, these were traumatized young men fleeing forced conscription. And they were abandoned to, mental health crises, self-harm, and eventually suicide. And that was going on with nary a peep from political journalists. You had some journalists covering the speech at Guardian and The Independent, but political journalists didn't really touch this story at all. Along comes Suella Braverman, who isn't necessarily more xenophobic than her predecessors, but, she is thunderingly stupid, and the lobby have turned against her. So the kind of things which would have just passed without comment, such as horrendous conditions in migrant processing centres, the spread of diseases, lack of access to legal representation, those things which have been the norm at places like Yarlswood and Brook House and Colnbrook, they're now drawing the attention of political journalists. So in a way, Suella Braverman, I think she almost looks a bit puzzled at some of the hostile reception that she's getting from sections of the press. And that's because the rules have changed on her. And that's because the lobby have really turned against the Conservatives after Liz Truss decided to crash the economy into a wall. But this is the kind of thing which has been going on for a really long time. And if what you want is to have a kinder and more humane system in place, then getting rid of this Home Secretary won't be enough. You have to look at the principles which are undergirding the way in which asylum and immigration policy is run. And the main principle is make life as nasty for asylum seekers as you can in the hope that it's going to discourage other people from making the crossing here. But what we found is that you make the conditions nastier and it's not going to discourage people because they're coming here for really good reasons. And if you're somebody who has, fled overland from a war or being persecuted, you're not going to let a Home Secretary stop you from being able to settle here and find some safety. So nastier immigration policy doesn't actually reduce asylum numbers at all. The thing that you should do, both morally and also practically, is expand safe and legal routes for people to claim asylum here. You manage as many claims in the community as you possibly can, so you don't treat people like they're prisoners and lock them up for indefinite periods of time. And also change some of the law. Allow asylum seekers to work while their claims are being processed, because then you bring them into the regulated legal economy, which means that they've got minimum wage provisions, workers' statutory rights, and it means that there's less pressure on the welfare system and you're not forcing them into the grey or the underground or the unregulated economy. These are all common sense policies, but because it flies in the face of the narrative which has been built up for well over 20 years now, there aren't going to be politicians who are brave enough to stand up for it.
Westminster journalists are being a bit harder on Braverman than they have been on previous Home Secretaries. It doesn't always mean they're siding with the rights and dignity of asylum seekers. This is what Robert Peston tweeted today. So part of a longer thread, but these stood out to me. Under English law, not European human rights law, the maximum length of stay is supposed to be 24 hours. There are some asylum seekers at Manston who have been there for 3 to 4 weeks. There is an assumption that charities specialising in help for asylum seekers will sue the government for keeping asylum seekers at Manston longer than the maximum 24 hours. As Home Office source told me, this creates prospect for Sunak's government that it will be forced to pay out maybe £5,000 or £6,000 each, not to those fleeing persecution in dangerous countries, but, for example, to Albanian economic migrants, many of whom may be criminals. This is not a Nigel Farage tweet. This is the political editor of ITV. Many of these people will be fleeing persecution, even if not 100% of them are, many of them will be. So why is he saying not to those fleeing persecution in dangerous countries, but, for example, to Albanian economic migrants, many of whom may be criminals? Why is he at the example, or the completely hypothetical example, by the way, that you've chosen?